My name is Navroz Dubash. I'm a professor here at SPEAR with a joint appointment in HMEI. And I am really, really pleased today to introduce our Bradford speaker, Professor Amir Lebdioui from Oxford. Amir is somebody whose work I've been following for a while, but I've been delighted to have a chance to meet him recently at a couple of meetings, and so I grabbed the opportunity to invite him to come and speak to all of us. So the formal invitation is that Amir is a development economist who works on the economic diversification of resource-dependent nations, green industrial policy, and low-carbon innovation, among many other things. But Amir is not just in teaching and researching about these things, but he's also advising governments. He's part of something called the Oxford Mexico Industrial Policy Lab, and is also the director of the TIDE Center, where TIDE stands for Technology and Industrialization for Development. So Amir is a sort of an emergent public intellectual in this area of green industrial policy, increasingly a way in which people are thinking about how to address the challenge of climate change, but also do so in ways that advance the interests of developing countries, bringing these two very challenging problems together. And I've learned a lot from listening to Amir. He's written a really great, accessible book called Survival of the Greenest that I recommend to you, and I think he'll provide a link to that. It's open access as well. So lots of ways in which to interact with Amir, and he's going to give us a doorway to that interaction through a talk today. So Amir, we're delighted to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Navroz. Thanks for the invitation, Ben and Navroz. I'm really looking forward to this chat. I'm here today with Baptiste Alberton, a postdoc at the TIDE Center. So for us, it's a really good opportunity to get to engage with you on many of those topics, which are getting increasingly important and increasingly urgent as we try to align ecological goals with developmental goals. So when I got this invitation from Navroz and Ben, I think they kind of want us to talk about green industrial policy, but what we really want to talk about is Clint Eastwood. So we're going to try to merge the two as his brilliance kind of, turns out also permeates into the field of green industrial policy. I don't know how familiar you are with green industrial policy, but the idea here is that green industrial policy, especially in the last 3-4 years, has really emerged as a popular policy agenda, right? As a way to seize the so-called green windows of opportunity for industrialization. However, green industrial policy is not always, the devil is in the details, right? It's not about the success, especially whose success depends on how well it's implemented. It depends on the role of governments. It depends on the global conjuncture, which is why the talk is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But before delving into this, part of this talk is based on my book, and then the second part will talk about what's next. But the idea here, there is a kind of Darwinian approach to this issue, which I think is useful. Because in many ways, and I guess some of you here in the US might feel it even more nowadays, humanity is kind of, it's kind of facing a test, almost a civilizational test, right? Of how well can we actually come together, right, to protect our own species and the environment the environment we live in. And Darwin wrote, the famous British naturalist, wrote that it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives, not even the strongest, but the one that is able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And this is true of us as a species, biologically, but it's also true of our economies. It's also true of our policies, right? And today, even more so, with the big changes that we've seen over the past few months, the challenge is just one of adaptation. right, and adjustment. How do we keep this agenda moving forward? But it calls for different narratives, it calls for different instruments, it calls for different coalitions. So this inspired my book, Survival of the Greenest, which, a little plug, is completely free to download. You can, Google it, but also with this link. And it's also very short. It's like 100 pages, which means that if you read it and you don't like it, you don't waste time and you don't waste money, right? Which is the book's main selling point. When I speak about survival, it's not just for the dramatic effect, no? It's actually economic survival. And one very good example, which is actually a cautionary tale, comes from the island nation of Nauru, right? I suppose that most of us don't spend much time thinking about Nauru and Nauru's development, but it has a lot to teach us. Because Nauru, believe it or not, used to be one of the richest countries in the world in the 1970s in terms of income per capita, right? Thanks to the extraction of its rich phosphate deposits. This is a picture of the then president of Nauru posing in front of his Rolls-Royce, just in front of the kind of phosphate deposits, right? That used to be the main source of income for the government. However, that phosphate was extracted in an environmentally damaging way, which destroyed the arable land, which used to be the main source of income and livelihoods for local populations for centuries before. You fast forward a few decades, as you can see from the aerial view of the island, is completely destroyed. There's no more nature. You can't grow food anymore. And Nauru went from being a high-income country back to being a low-income country. And now the main source of income for the government is that the island is being used to host a refugee detention center on behalf of Australia, right? So this is basically a horror story going back to Clint Eastwood and his Western movies. But it's a cautionary tale, because what Nauru really shows, what happened to Nauru might happen to many other countries today that depend on non-renewable resources, right? Let's remember, you don't have to bring the climate twist or the climate objective to talk about transition to renewable forms of energy. Non-renewable resources are non-renewable. If you run out, you're really screwed, right? And governments sometimes kind of tend to forget that, right? The conversation has become perhaps too much about the ecological dimension, not enough about the sheer resilience and technological superiority offered by renewable forms of energy. And what the case of Nauru also teaches us is that it's present decisions that inform long-term transformational possibilities. It's now too late for Nauru, right? But if they wanted to keep the different development pathways open, it's back in the 70s that those decisions were made. So this is really in contrast to the standard grow now, clean up later rhetoric, right? Because actually, if you grow now in a particular way, you might not even be able to clean up later. Or at least, even if you clean up, you might not be able to align economic prosperity with ecological goals. So let's start with the good, where industrial policy comes in here, right? It's really about aligning those different agendas together, make sure that ecological transitions offer spaces, right, for development, for prosperity, for jobs, which in many countries, this is how you sell, right, the climate agenda, right, in terms of improving people's well-being. Green industrial policy is extremely important because there are many great opportunities for economic transformations that arise from sustainability, right? And the way to unlock them is with industrial policy. It's with strong state interventions. Three main avenues to align these two agendas. One is through the concept of green window of opportunity, popularized by Rasmus Lemma, Roberta Rabiolotti, but also Xiaolan Fu, who's the founder of the Tide Center. And here the idea is the deployment of low-carbon technologies offer opportunities for upstream and downstream diversification around renewable tech, right, in different segments of those supply chains, which for developing countries may open kind of an entry door to industrialization, while the standard industrialization, now there are blocked routes to entry, notably because of the intense competition, especially from China. I know that Kyle here does a lot of work on that. Though I would argue that even for green technologies, now the competition is already intense, so some of those windows of opportunity are already closing, but some others are still open. The second one is related to the so-called fourth industrial revolution with the advent of cyber-physical systems. Things like artificial intelligence, right? Which, as you all know, is highly energy intensive, right? So as it stands, AI, the kind of energy needs, electricity needs of AI development and maintenance is unsustainable, right? So moving forward, countries that don't have access to a cheap and clean energy source, will face more hurdles to attract this kind of state-of-the-art technologies for the fourth industrial revolution. The third one is quite different. It's the idea of environmental upgrading, where environmental measures, they're not a cost to production systems, but actually they're an opportunity for value generation. Because either you use less resources when you produce a good, right? So you basically save costs. You don't use as much energy, or you don't use as much materials, which is good, and sometimes you can get there with some smart design or smart engineering. But also opportunities for basically increasing like a market premium for greener goods. So companies like Patagonia, right, typically are able to extract more value or charge more to consumers because their goods are made of recycled materials. But it's also an opportunity for intersectoral upgrading. So if you actually start with circular economy initiatives to use or reuse your waste, right, that waste can become an input into a different activity, and therefore that helps your firm diversify, right? For example, in Uruguay, dairy farms start to reuse cow waste and cow excrement as a source of biofuels. And many of the dairy farms, basically, biofuels is now a higher source of revenues than milk, right? So there are many examples like this that exist, and this is a way to kind of reconceive, waste towards input. So this is the good part. Those channels exist. They're really well documented in the literature, in firm level experiences. That's great, right? So green industrial policy is possible. However, and that's when we come to the bad, those opportunities have been highly consolidated, right? This value, right, generated from green structural transformation has been captured by a handful of actors in a handful of countries. Several of the channels that I mentioned hinge upon access to renewable energy sources, right? They require investment in renewable energy capacity, and then you can do the whole green industrialization around. Now, the continent where you have most of the people in the world that still don't have access to electricity is Sub-Saharan Africa. About almost 600 million people without access to electricity. And I think some of you might come from engineering or climate science. This is also a continent where it's well documented. There are fantastic opportunities and potential for low-cost geothermal, hydropower, solar energy generation. So if you think of where the money, where investments for renewables should go, you have potential and you have need, right? Now, we're also seeing record numbers of renewable energy investment, worldwide every year. Now it's about $2 trillion, I believe. If you put it in per capita terms, and if you divide it by region, that's about $180 for the US and Canada. It's about $140 for Japan, $120 for Europe. Guess what's the value for Africa, for Sub-Saharan Africa, of renewable energy investment per capita annually? Take a guess. those that haven't actually seen the numbers in the book. Two? Yes, 2% of investments, actually. But in dollars. US is $180. What do you think is the equivalent value in sub-Saharan Africa? No wrong answers. It's just about perceptions. $3? Very pessimistic. The actual answer is 50 cents. Yeah. This is a rounded up figure, but actually since then it has reduced by half. This figure tells you almost everything you need to know about the state of the kind of green economy globally now, right? Investments in renewables are not driven by need or even by ecological sense. It's not even invested in the areas where you expect the highest relative growth in emissions, right? But it's really driven by trade interests and the perception of capturing those green windows of opportunity. And what you see on the kind of financial side of things, you see it across different dimensions. You see it in the jobs landscape. Most of the jobs that have been created in renewables, oh yeah, by the way, there are now net job gains in renewable energy, right? So more jobs created than jobs lost. And now, since 2021, there are more jobs in renewables than fossil fuels worldwide, which is great. But the problem is those jobs are not created in the same places that those jobs are lost. And you see that most of the countries that heavily depend on fossil fuels, a source of income and jobs, they're not able to capture those jobs. Same with trade and export markets. Only 3 countries, China, Germany, the US, account for half of global low-carbon technology products, exports, right? The rise of China is really spectacular, you know, in that regards, and kind of explains a lot of the emergence of green industrial policy worldwide, right? Because as countries realize that China has been kind of, you know, on the path to dominance in the game, they kind of woke up a bit late and, you know, you always follow market forces when you have time for things, but when you have to rush, this is when state interventions comes in, right? So if you put it in comparative advantage terms, something that is kind of striking when it comes to low carbon technology products, environmental goods, is that most of the developing world, right, is not poised to generate a comparative advantage in low carbon technology products. What that means is actually quite frightening, right? Because many of these countries face a triple punishment. One, these countries tend to be disproportionately affected by climate and transition risks, right? Because of the kind of structure of the economy, they depend on agricultural products, which are more sensitive to temperature and precipitation fluctuations. But these countries, even when their governments don't seem to care much about those risks, credit rating agencies are increasingly taking those risks into account when setting country credit scores, right? Which means that because of those perceptions of risks, those countries are facing even higher costs of borrowing, right? And 3, they seem to be pushed out of the industrial opportunities that are offered by global decarbonization. If you look at most of Latin America, most of Africa, most of Southeast Asia. We often talk about critical minerals. I assume here in Princeton, probably you speak a lot about them too. And very often they're portrayed as, this is the developing country's entry door, right, to those kind of green technology supply chain because they have a lot of lithium and they have a lot of cobalt and whatnot. But in practice, that seems to be more wishful thinking. Because historically, this is not something that you see, and even now, the few developing countries that are really, you know, kind of managed to develop comparative advantages, they haven't done so because of their natural resource endowment, but they have done so because of their pre-existing technological capabilities in industrial sectors. Malaysia, second largest exporter of solar cells in the world. That is thanks to the fact that they had a pre-existing electronic sector, right? So if you want to produce solar cells, it helps a lot that you have basically capabilities to produce semiconductors, right? The technology is very similar. Mexico is producing EVs, but they had a pre-existing automotive assembly sector, right? So they leveraged this to produce EVs. China, with solar cells, it's also pre-existing capabilities in electronics and other sectors. Brazil is not there for wind turbines, but it's a large producer of wind turbines. Some of you know and some of you research. But actually, it's the pre-existing aerospace engineering capabilities that help them produce wind turbines. Because the turbines you need for planes, right, technologies helps you a lot producing turbines for wind. And a lot of these countries, right, that have a lot of lithium and cobalt and whatnot, truth is, if you look at it historically, critical minerals are, the criticality is very space and time bound. What's critical today might not be critical tomorrow. And in fact, it has happened often when countries have tried to add value or restrict supply of their critical mineral. Scientists in the north figure out a way to substitute that mineral from something else, right? Cobalt. Cobalt initially was used for magnets in the 70s and 80s. But because of supply disruptions from the DRC, which holds 60% of global cobalt reserves, scientists figured out how to replace cobalt in magnets. And today, you have a lot of investments in R&D for batteries that don't use cobalt, that don't use lithium, right? Solid-state batteries, hydrogen-based batteries, and so on. So there are a lot of risks there. So we spoke about the good, we spoke about the bad, but we haven't mentioned the ugly yet. And the ugly part is the fact that this kind of unevenness in the industrial geography of decarbonization is not an era of omission, right? It's not like, well, some countries are really just proactive, right? Their governments are pushing for it and the other ones are not, or maybe we'll kind of, with enough advocacy or enough academic research, we'll bring attention to those dynamics and the world will be better. No, the ugly part is that these inequalities, right, they're exclusionary by design, right? So the way that green industrial policy has been practiced over the past, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, is one in which countries are intentionally kicking away the green ladder, to echo the book of the great Hadrun Chang. And there is a kind of, the practice of green industrial policy is more marked by green protectionism, right, than from a desire to just increase the cost competitiveness of industries in a particular geography. I'll give you an example on the green side of things. Can you raise your hand if you do not think that bicycles are an environmentally friendly product? Now, can you raise your hand if you think that bikes are an environmentally friendly product? All right, that's most of us. Well, the European Union will disagree with you. Because if they accepted to include bicycles as an environmental good, they would have had, at the negotiations for the Environmental Goods Agreement at the WTO, they would have had to remove tariffs on bicycles, right? The agreement includes things like electric vehicles, wind turbines, and so on. But if they had removed tariffs on bikes, they would have had to import, or basically the Chinese bicycle industry would have just wiped out the entire Italian bicycle industry, right? At the moment, the tariffs on bikes in Europe are about 100%, right? They don't want cheaper bikes, basically. So for the Chinese, it was a key source of contention, right? Because if the whole point of the agreement is to reduce tariffs on goods that can help us fight climate change, why the heck are we cherry picking, right, based on each country's trade interests? Because that defies the whole purpose of the agreement. And that was one of the main tension points that led to the breakdown of the negotiations. And until this day, we do not have an environmental goods agreement. This is one example, but I could spend about an hour speaking about all the hypocrisy, all the goods. But the main point is that we have to be careful what's green. What the label green is highly political, right? And very often, It's about what we don't talk about that is equally interesting than what we don't talk about. And environmental regulations, unfortunately, are often used as a form of trade protectionism, right? Well, up until recently, countries were not, they were afraid of imposing new tariffs. That's not the case anymore, but they were using environmental regulations, right? Suddenly you say, that product is not so green because of X, Y, Z, so we don't want that. But suddenly, you know, that other thing which actually we happen to want to develop, that's completely fine. What happened? So, the good, the bad, and the ugly. How do we move forward? So, we're really at the crossroads, right? We're thinking about green industrial policy. And there's a lot at stakes. Because if the practice of green industrial policy remains exclusionary, both within countries but also amongst countries, this will prevent the central promise of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN of leaving no one behind, right? So for the agenda to survive, it needs to be completely rethought. The few things that I want to mention, and these are particularly the kind of strands of work that we're developing at the Tide Center, and for which we hope to also collaborate with you guys. So the first thing is there's no green silver bullet with green industrial policy, right? And you need to adapt the agenda to different ecological, economic, and institutional contexts. I mentioned ecological because the green side of things, you know, what's green depends, right, from place to place. Very often when we think about green policies or green industrial policy, we think about emissions, right, and emissions reductions. But it's just one side of the story, and this is work that we're doing, a book that we're preparing with Baptiste and Hajun Cheng on kind of how to adapt industrial policy to also the issue of material footprint and also the issue of biodiversity loss, right, water scarcity. I know one of you, Nikita, used to work on Namibia, right, and green hydrogen. But green hydrogen helps, you know, with countries that want to reduce their emissions, like Germany. But in Namibia, it's a water scarce country, right? So do you really want to use up your little water resources to reduce emissions when you actually haven't contributed much to climate change? Economic contexts, because as I mentioned earlier, the way that countries have embarked on different green supply chains, a lot depends on their starting points, right? And what they actually have, what's the technological capacity they have, and therefore what windows are opened. But then we need to rethink this context to countries, especially poor countries that don't have much to begin with. And institutional context. This one is perhaps the most important because, as you know, industrial policy used to be a very taboo subject, right? For the past 30 years, people were not talking about it. It seemed to, is the policy that, you know, no one wanted to touch, even though everyone was doing it discreetly, right? But now that it's become fairly obvious that countries are using it, the narrative that the IMF has been pushing for, it took about a year to figure out what would be the message. And now the message is handle with care. That's actually the name of the report that came out recently. And the message is, yeah, okay, green industrial policy can work sometimes, but it really only works if you're China or the US, because you have the right type of governance mechanisms. That's actually the word being used, right, for industrial policy. But if you're not these two countries, don't play with fire, don't touch. This is, you know, you're gonna mess it up, right? And this is really a way to kind of kick away that ladder, right? Because the whole question is not whether you have the institutional capacity for industrial policy, you know, is what are the different types of institutional capabilities that you could acquire, but also how can you actually adapt green industrial policy to your own context, right? Working with what you have instead of wishing you were a different country. In that space, the issue is many developing countries now are kind of blindly imitating those industrial policy instruments being done elsewhere without that process of adaptation, right? So for example, you see a lot of local content requirements for solar and wind in many parts of the world, in many parts of Africa. This is arguably the worst industrial policy you can do if you're a latecomer, if you don't have a big domestic market size, because you just make the price of your renewables more expensive, right? And you make it less competitive downstream. The other thing is green industrial policy isn't just about manufacturing solar panels and wind turbines, which is kind of the image everyone has, right? If it's a green industrial policy, you have to just build that thing and export it. That's just simply not true. And in fact, because the incumbents are making it so difficult for others to follow the same strategy, they need to think about a different way to do it, right? This is very kind of reminiscent of the Korean economist Kun Lee and in his book, The Art of Catch-up. He explains that historically, the way countries kind of reach the technological frontier is not by imitation or following exactly the same strategy of the incumbent, but by taking a detour, right? So he uses a sports analogy to say that if you're running behind someone, you can't overtake, right? But if you then take a different lane and switch, that's how you can overtake them. And here I want to mention 3 key issues. The institutional side of things, maybe I'll skip the fossil fuel producers, and in the context of small nations, which is work that we're doing with Baptiste. Institutional aspect. So we often focus about the recipe for industrial policy, right? But in fact, has it ever happened to you that you try to follow a recipe that maybe one of your parents gave you, that you saw online, and what you cooked was absolutely gross and disgusting? It happened to me several times, more than I wish. But the idea here is not just about the recipe. The cook matters just as much, or perhaps even more, right? Because the best chefs, it doesn't matter the ingredients they have, they'll just fix something up and it'll still be good. With industrial policy is the same, right? So here, the cook, what are the capacity, what are the capabilities, right, that governments need to have to make sure that their green industrial policies are more likely to succeed? Now, in the last few years, virtually almost every government or half of governments worldwide have a green industrial policy strategy of some kind, right? There's a document that has, there are great documents, technically sound, but then they have no capacity to implement it, right? So how to actually make it happen? How to design industrial policy from the beginning, right? Where you build stronger social coalitions and with a clear vision of where you want to go. A friend once told me that it's good to have a vision, but too many visions can lead to hallucinations, no? So in that sense, there's been a lot of hallucinations in green industrial policy, but not enough clear visions that actually get you there. And here, this is where the role of civil society is particularly important. Because governments, the reality of governments in developing countries is that they don't have, it's true, they don't have the capacity of the governments as in China and the US. We just got back from a policy forum in Mexico, where you have about 5 people in the Ministry of Economy that are working on industrial policy, right? It's heavily limiting. But this is where other actors can play a key role, and civil society can play a key role in helping the design of industrial policies, balancing different interests, right? Because very often when you don't have the capacity or the staff to do the plan, you go to the private sector, to industry associations, and they kind of feed you either whatever they want, or also the limited information they have, right, about kind of what's aligning with their interests, but not the whole spectrum, right, of possibilities that exist. 2, the implementation capacity. And here I want to focus specifically on the interministerial coordination. Because with green industrial policy, that cannot be the mandate of a Ministry of Industry and Trade, right? Like industrial policy back in the days, especially in East Asia. You need cross-ministerial coordination, including with the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Environment, because again, environmental regulations, you can use them really well to manipulate demand for certain products over others. And that in practice has been one of the biggest hurdles for developing countries, right? In Brazil, very ambitious country in terms of green industrial policy, perhaps too ambitious to the extent that they have about 4 different types of green industrial policies at the moment, pushed by 4 different ministries that are kind of don't get along. And there are some overlaps, but also huge trade-offs between those documents. So it's very hard to kind of figure out, but which one of those is the actual plan? And that's because Brazil does not have strong interministerial coordination mechanisms, right, where different ministers can actually agree on something, but also the fact that it's a coalition government, right? Those ministries come from different parties, and they're kind of responsible to different constituents. In Malaysia, they have the economic planning unit, which has really helped that process, because the economic planning unit is in charge of the 5-year plan, but it's a big consultative process. They speak to everyone in the process, to industry association, to academia, to different ministries, civil society. So therefore, everybody has to agree on the plan, right, for it to come out. So it becomes a really robust plan. And then they chase each government agency, each ministry, to see how they are, meeting the terms in the plan. In China, which obviously is a very different country, has a very different system, and so on, but that coordination is quite interesting because they went as far as completely removing the Ministry of Energy when realizing that, in their context, energy is a cross-ministerial issue, right? So instead of having it as a separate institution that is making separate decisions, it's now a national, since 2013, a National Energy Commission, right, which is a cross-ministerial commission, right? And the fact that they're able to go as far, even restructuring how the government works based on that policy incoherence, is quite interesting. And perhaps that's one of the great lessons we can draw from China. Not on the policy that it actually does, right, which makes sense in their context, but in this kind of institutional learning by doing. Which leads to the third point, on the ability to evaluate monetary industrial policies, but also adjust them. We are quite impatient with industrial policies, right? When industrial policies fail, it's the whole mandate that comes down. Danny Roderick talks about venture capitalism, right? To say that industrial policy is a bit like venture capitalism. You might get a lot of things wrong, but the most important is that the ones that you get right, if they actually generate positive gains. But I would say that actually industrial policy is more like the difference between curling and bowling. Any curling fans here? That's what I thought. No one likes curling. It's a very popular sport. But I hope to convince you of the value of curling with this analogy. With bowling, you throw the ball and you hope that down the line is going to strike, right? You can't touch it. Green industrial policy governments have done it the same way. You have a plan and then just let's hope you hit the mark, right? Even though there are market disruptions, regulatory changes, one country imposing tariffs on everyone, technology that changes, right? New disruptions, but you still have the same plan. But with curling, you don't leave it to chance, right? You have those people with that kind of broom-like thing that kind of adjust the trajectory of the disc, right? And try to get it closer to hitting the mark. And that's why we need a curling approach to industrial policy, right? One where you expect, right, these kind of changes are not a surprise, but you expect those disruptions to happen, but you're able to adapt your plan accordingly, right? As the great Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So with green industrial policy, it's the same. You should actually be expecting you'll get punched in the mouth, right? That's kind of part of the game. Incumbents, that's how they behave. You're not going to take their market share and they're suddenly going to make it easier for you and invest in renewables, in your country so that you also get that window of opportunity. It's wishful thinking. We would like a world that works this way, but it just hasn't happened. And the last part here, which is really important, and I think it's more like a topic for conversation here. When we work on those issues, we tend to focus on really large economies that are actually doing all the interesting and impressive stuff, China, even in the global south, China, Brazil, India, US, if you consider that you guys are moving closer to the global south. But there are many smaller countries out there, right, where the contexts are really different. What if you're Togo? What if you're Guatemala? What if you're Nicaragua? What do you do, right? The rules of the games are really different there. And so with Baptiste, the work that we're doing on that front, which we hope to get out in a couple of weeks, is presenting green industrial policy as a prisoner's dilemma, right? Where the issue here is one of coordination between smaller countries. Because the truth is, without coordination regionally, there's a glass ceiling on what they can achieve because they don't have the economies of scale, right? And and they don't have all the assets that you need as an input. And that coordination between different countries is one where you actually maximize gains with cooperation, right? But usually you only think about your own interest, and that has prevented countries to come together for regional plans. So we actually start to look at, historically, how have governments come together when they needed to kind of, collaborate on industrial policy issues. And we find that there are three main ways that governments have done it. One, the minilateral level, is kind of governments, coming together with a smaller group of governments and pulling their resources together, right, in a specific industry to create a champion. The best example is Airbus in Europe. France, Germany, Spain, UK, coming together. It's hard to think nowadays, but they did. Why? Because of the threat posed by Boeing, right? And they didn't want Boeing to have the kind of monopoly of airspace. But they knew that alone, there's no way they could compete with Boeing. So they pulled their resources together to create Airbus. The second one is the multilateral, coordination through a regional council. The best example of this is in Asia, with the ASEAN Coordinating Council, where governments retain control and ownership, but they come together in those spaces to coordinate their policies, harmonize standards, and join their markets. The third one is through the supranational body, which they argue doesn't work as well. So this is things like the European Union, their Green Deal, or the African Union. But the issue there is that governments don't have much ownership of those plans, right? So these institutions are really good at putting a plan together, but then they don't really have the mandate to make governments follow up and implement that plan. So we have been thinking about, and he's actually using someone from Princeton, their research in physics on large coordinative non-convex optimization systems. I'm not going to pretend to know what that actually means in physics, but we just found it extremely useful to apply to the issue of industrial policy. Because the idea here is that for these governments, and that's the work that we apply in Latin America with Baptiste, is in fact the challenge in Latin America, the region has been mostly talking about regional integration, right? And the kind of failed promise of integration. But that's actually perhaps a wrong way to look at it, because the challenge is one of coordination, not integration. You don't necessarily want to integrate, which is politically too ambitious. You just have to coordinate industrial policies, even between governments that might hate each other, right? But because they actually see the net gains of that cooperation game, right? In which their national interests or national gains increase, right, with a system of multilateral coordination. And the idea of the coordinating body here is that it's not just about setting the target, but then informing governments in a feedback loop about within all their plans, where are the duplications, where are the fallacy of composition, but where are also the kind of blind spots, right? Where no one is investing in to make the whole thing more competitive. And then governments are then able to readjust their plan, right, to see where opportunities might lie. So, to conclude, going green is not just an ecological act, but it's first and foremost an act of macroeconomic resilience, right? And it requires industrial policy in many ways, especially in an age of polycrisis, where industrial policy represents a powerful instrument to rally a kind of broader coalition of people, right, to understand their needs, to make green not something that has a cost to them, but kind of something aspirational, which provides opportunities for low-income groups, for workers, and other groups, including fossil fuel companies, by the way. It's a terrible business model, like they're extracting something that is non-renewable, and their institutional structure, especially international oil companies which are expected to generate profit for shareholders, they're not really geared to move to transition, but national oil companies, somehow surprisingly, energy transition should actually be part of their core mandate, right? Because the kind of rent that is generated is done at the macroeconomic level, but they don't have the same kind of profit mandate as international oil companies. Expanding the scope for green industrial policy to address different types of economic, social, and ecological issues, including gender, income, and spatial inequalities, which require going beyond traditional thinking. There's also an issue of time sensitiveness. A lot of green industrial policy is about long-term goals. But in democracies, when you have 4 or 5 years, what are the quick wins that you can actually secure to get people excited, right? So people can actually see a meaningful change that you're able to deliver and that it buys you more time to continue with your green industrial policy. The IRA was supposed to do that. And frankly, it has done that quite effectively in terms of quick benefits. But the one thing that it didn't do too well is, which I forgot to mention, is the kind of ability to control the narrative, right? I mean, I understand the kind of political logic behind calling it Inflation Reduction Act, but what a terrible name for a green industrial policy. I mean, no one can get excited behind something called the Inflation Reduction Act, even though I understand that, the reality of passing things like this through Congress, but if it doesn't really have even the intention of reducing inflation, you're kind of setting yourself for failures, no? And workers didn't feel that this is something that benefited them. So moving forward, those decisions on what to produce and how to produce and where to produce are way too important to leave to governments alone and firms, but you need to get more stakeholders on board. And lastly, in many places of the world, going green needs to be aspirational and it needs to be developmental. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Amir. As I've come to realize just from our short interaction, that was both insightful, clear, and shot through with bits of humor. So can't ask for much more. I think the floor is now open to questions. You feel free to moderate it yourself.
Okay.
Call on people.
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. This is more of a clarifying question. When you were saying we should emphasize more coordination but not integration, I wondered if you can be a little more concrete about what kind of coordination would be useful. I agree with about the feasibility, but I think a lot of people push for integration because that's the main way to increase the market and should get a profit. So I wonder, what do you see as a very useful coordination to have that we don't really need to go for integration necessarily?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Should we take a round of questions?
Yeah, let's take 3 or 4.
Thank you. This was amazing. I just wanted to invite you to talk about the oil companies.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
A question about also coordination
Yeah.
in terms of is the mechanism through which the coordination is going to be more effective for countries one that it constrains the space of possible and industrial policy for them, something that they would be able to work on cooperatively, or is it something where it is a protective effect from the exclusionary nature of the world system, where it gives them more of a foothold that they can actually engage within? And then as a follow-up to that, as coordination increases in the realm of industrial policy, do you see that as fracturing existing trade lines and things like that, so that there's going to be much more clustering within groups of trading and industrial policies that will affect future world systems, or is it something that's a little bit different than that?
Super. Any other question? You had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to ask about the point you're making about the kind of, macroeconomic resilience and how that interacts with short-term victories versus long-term gains.
Yeah.
And especially just wondering, right, what role you think ethics might play, or some of these other values, because one of the draws of economics is to try to put it in kind of value neutral or maybe self-interested terms, but there's
Yeah.
the concern that the reason why there's a reason why fossil fuel companies are why this is we have a fossil economy, and it's because it puts a lot of short-term benefits at the expense of future generations and all of the developing countries. They
Yeah.
Externalizes these costs. So I just wonder how do you see things?
Yeah, these are very good questions. Do you know anyone, in your entourage, or that just really loves petroleum, that kind of believes in petroleum, that just loves that product? You do? Okay. How so? Fair enough. How so?
Well, my husband's from Texas.
Yeah, okay. That says it all. So to answer that question, actually for the rest, Baptiste, if you don't mind jumping in. So my own belief is that I don't think that they're kind of pro-climate and against climate people as much as they're kind of short-termists and long-termists, because apart from your husband and many others, it feels like a lot of people that kind of are pro-carbon intensity, they're just kind of valuing the short term over the long term, right? And in many ways in the short term, sometimes it makes more sense, right? But if you really take a long-term view, no one's really in love with the product, right? But it's kind of like and renewables make a lot more sense. It's not even beyond the environmental aspect, right? And even when you think about the environmental risks, these are something that can rally many people. Even insurance companies are facing a lot of losses from climate-induced disasters. It becomes in everyone's interest, but how to actually bring that kind of long-term thinking seems to be the real challenge. Not so much to talk about whether you care about climate or not, but how to get people to adopt or to kind of value the future over present needs. On coordination, Baptiste, you should take that question.
On coordination, part of the work that I've been doing was also focused on Latin America. I will take Latin America because it's a good example. It's probably one of the regions that has the long-lasting and diverse, made the most efforts to try to integrate, like from Bolivar in the early 19th century and up to this day. And what we can see is that a succession of integration initiatives, like a lot. And when you look at the trade data, actually intra-trade is only 50% of like the total trade of the region. So there is a kind of a de jure integration and de facto disintegration, actually, or lack of interdependence. And we reflected on why it's the case, and one of the big factors is that sometimes the mechanisms have been extremely ambitious and not been able to kind of last in time and across political cycles as well. So one of the main ideas is like trying to find mechanisms that can really create for governments an opportunity to identify a mutuality of interest. And for that to happen, we think that coordination across certain issues or across certain sectors, for example, is much more easier because it creates kind of it creates an opportunity to recognize that you can align your policy and gain from cooperation and coordinating your policies. And one important idea, I think, is that it can lead then to institutional linkages. So you start small and flexible, and then with the repetition of interaction with the successes, you can build up like more and more ambitious, like let's say, scope of coordination. So that's the idea of why we insist on the coordinating mechanism rather than integration. So in a way, coordination could lead in the future to integration. That could be like the end result. But we think that emphasizing coordination is more important. And then on the more like geoeconomic or geopolitical aspect, it's not that we kind of claim that the future of the world needs to be based on regional blocks necessarily. It's more about like increasing the chances for industrial policy to success in these countries, not necessarily by exclusively relying then on regional trade, but more by increasing the policy space and the chance. I don't know if you need to add something.
Any other points, comments, criticisms?
I did like curling.
Nice.
We're seeing other parts of the world take the opportunity under the pressure of the current administration here to start up taking more action on building their military and other things. If the U.S. is abandoning a lot of green efforts by the pressure of the administration, what are you seeing that other groups are doing to maybe grab some of that startup opportunity? I think if the U.S. gets to reverse, they're going to try to claw that back. But you're saying that they need to have a bigger role there. Is that happening? They could take our scientists, they're taking our educators to Canada and also.
That's a very good question. Yeah. Ben.
I just want to introduce the geopolitical dynamic. When Patrick Chang wrote Kicking Away the Ladder, this was largely about the West and how the West had kicked away the
Yeah.
Now, the technologies that you're talking about, the real power is in China.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about kicking, at the same time you have, even in the last week, the US is doing a lot to push the rest of the world more, to orient itself more towards China.
Yeah.
How do you evaluate, I mean, you've just talked about like the China and the US,
Uh-huh.
and you bracketed some of the power considerations that are attached to those country labels. How do you evaluate the role of China as potentially being keen on kicking away a green ladder for other developing countries?
So you left the tough questions for the second round, I see.
One question at the back.
Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a very good question. So, let's start with China. Let's see, Kyle is also behind. He might add a few things. So, you're right. The whole dynamic is different because the country that has technology dominance in that space, actually one of the big players is China. And actually, it seems to me that, well, China has benefited. So funny enough, the Tide Center was created 17 years ago, as a way to explain kind of China's use of technology transfer policies to, as part of its own industrialization system, right? And now the new project that we're starting is about how to use low carbon tech transfer from China to the rest of the world. So we've come full circle. And it seems that China is not quite doing that yet. But I suppose that this will be a lot about what China brings to the table in the next few years, especially with other developing countries, but also with Europe, right? You might have seen Europe is now demanding technology transfer from China, which is kind of mad and beautiful at the same time, right? But especially in a world where development cooperation is in crisis, lower carbon tech transfer, I hope, emerges as a form, right, to meaningfully engage between governments and especially how China can engage with the rest of the world. My understanding, though it might be superficial, is that the Chinese policymakers have not quite defined what role they want to play with developing countries, right? They seem to be also concerned that they don't want to have the same label as others have had in terms of kind of imperialism or the whole reputation about resource-backed loans and so on, even though the evidence is actually quite mixed. But I think that in the process of kind of searching what's different about how China engages, and there are some differences, historically and so on. But that, I hope, is something that will pave the way. The issue is developing countries have not been really demanding that. In the same way, the EU is the one demanding technology transfer. But developing countries, to go back to your question, I haven't seen developing countries that engage with China and say, look, we want your technology, we want to learn. So, it takes two to tango. Your question about industrial policy and narrative is a very good question because it really depends. In some countries, including mine, if you talk about green industrial, which is a fossil fuel exporter, has a lot of renewable energy potential, but no investment in renewables. If you talk about green industrial policy from a climate action standpoint, all the doors will just close to your nose, right? Because it's not the country's historic responsibility, because they feel that the Europeans are not doing their share. Why would they transition? But if you speak about it from a kind of energy security angle, then you change the whole dynamic, right? And where are you from? Nigeria, great. So exactly the same dynamics as my country. You could actually transition, and I suppose in Nigeria you consume a lot of oil and gas domestically, right? And the pace of consumption of those resources tends to be even faster than the pace of production of those resources. So if you continue that path, in 10 years, in 20 years, 30 years. You might have to import those resources to meet national demand, right? So if you frame transitions or green industrial policy as a way to free up those resources instead of being subsidized, you can still sell them overseas, but at least it creates more resilience to your economy. You get more actors on board. And this is why narratives are really important, right? We know by now in many fields, but it's almost obvious that we forgot that, humans are not rational beings, but they're emotional beings, right, in many ways. So when discussing those things, you need to, kind of get to what people really care about. It might be climate action, we're discussing it with Navros. It might be national security concerns. It might be inequality concerns. There might be a kind of wide range of reasons why governments want to push for, but one needs to really do their homework in terms of figuring out or taking the pulse, right, to kind of figure out what would be the narrative that gets people moving. And by the way, this is where development cooperation, I think, has failed in many ways. When governments come in, typically European development agencies, this is recorded, right? Yeah, too bad. I won't name any. But when they go to different countries and they say, oh, we have those fundings because we need you to transition and we have that kind of emissions that we want to reduce, that's the worst way to engage with governments, because then even if they're doing it, they're not owning the agenda and they can't even justify it to their own constituents, right? So that's not, I think, a proactive way to engage.
Can I just add something too? So I think it's not only about the retail units, but also then the overall capacity that China has in retail. And that, I think, adds a layer of complexity, because unless China totally reorients its development model towards domestic consumption, it will definitely need markets too. So it creates, you can see it in two ways. So or developing countries don't cooperate and coordinate, and they will be dumping markets for China's excess capacity, or actually by cooperating as well, coordinating policies or increasing bargaining power by joining efforts, they could create also the conditions to potentially demand more from China, who will need their market actually to keep the engine going. So I think also this adds to the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, there were two questions that sadly we didn't answer. That's because they're really tough questions. But hopefully, there'll be more clarity over time, and maybe hope that's something that happens. Yeah, but hopefully there's something that picks up there. And I'll just finish with one analogy. We spoke about running and athleticism, and Navroz is a big fan of Lionel Messi. But when you think about green industrial policy and protectionism, one way to do it is what the US is now doing, which is to put hurdles on the other athletes' lanes. So you're just kind of trying to slow down everybody else while you catch up. But no one benefits from that. The climate agenda doesn't benefit. The global development agenda doesn't benefit. In which you move towards a green industrial policy, which almost entirely focuses on getting equipped with the speed-enhancing shoes, right? So you kind of run faster than your competitors and not just delaying everyone, where we all suffer from that. So hopefully that's where the world would move in, even though now it doesn't look good. But we need to have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, as Gramsci said. Yeah. But looking forward to engage those questions on. These are things that we're working on, that we're developing over the next few years. We are keen to hear about your research, about your concerns, what keeps you awake at night. So don't hesitate to engage, and hopefully this will take a collective endeavor, to push on these questions.
Thank you, Amir. That was really, really wonderful. I think I like the way you sort of managed to find a way to end it on a somewhat optimistic note, despite all the sort of clouds on the horizon. And I think we'll have to have you back, because I've heard you give a talk that's entirely around sport metaphors.
Yeah.
And we need to get that one as well. Thank you, Baptiste. Thank you, Amir. Really stimulating afternoon, and we'll definitely keep this conversation going.
No, thank you, Navras. Thanks.